and welcome to Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. I'm Faithless Forrest.
And I'm Joe Barnhart, and we want you to know that if you don't believe that there's a God, or if you do, you shouldn't be alone. You aren't alone. And we want to welcome you to dialogue with us if you have time, to think with us. And it's a show for people who want to be free thinkers, open agnostics or atheists or free of supernatural beliefs or whoever. Just join us.
Well, today's topic is going to be biblical criticism, the historicity of Jesus, and so on.
Historicity of Jesus, right.
All right.
And we want to tell you a little about the sponsors of our program. First of all, the Atheist Society of Knoxville has a fun meeting at an eatery tonight at Barley's in the Old City around 5:30.
All right. And
then the East Tennessee Rationalists is the other sponsor of this group.
All righty, I'll take that one. The Rationalists of East Tennessee have several regular monthly meetings. The first and third Sunday mornings are often lively roundtable discussions. They're held in the cafeteria annex at the Goins building, the Goins Administrative Building at the Pellissippi State Technical Community College. Programs start at 10:30, but come a little early for coffee and conversation. On the second Sunday of the month, we have the Skeptics Book Club. We'll try and tell you about this month's book after the mid-program break. And on the fourth Sunday, we're having these potluck get-togethers we call a reflection meeting. There's usually a chosen discussion topic, and we pass around the talking stick. No one talks unless they got the stick. That way everyone gets their say.
Yeah.
Yep. All right, and some Sundays we're maybe doing some board games. I'm hoping that in May we're going to have a picnic. That'll be on
a good activity.
That'll be on a Thursday.
And later in the show we'll give you our website for additional details and the times and locations.
All right. Well, in the news, Joe, you had something here in the news?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. Yeah.
All right. And this is a publication you brought to me. It's Baptist Today. All right.
That's interesting.
Well, let me read from Baptist Today. This is about a quote from the new Pope, Pope Francis. He noted during a parish visit some months ago, he even, quote, rebuked, unquote, a woman who was pregnant again after having 7 children, all delivered by cesarean section. Quote, "But do you want to leave 7 orphans?" unquote, Francis told her. "That is to tempt God." So this Pope's quite different than the previous one.
Different. And I think what's happened is the Catholics in Europe, including Italy, practice birth control because it's common sense.
All right.
And the Pope realizes that he has constituents that he has to relate to, and you can't just be a celibate telling people how to run their lives if they're married.
All right.
I think this has dawned on him. And
so he's catching up to the flock, so to speak.
Catching up to the flock is a good way to put it.
All right. Well, I'm paraphrasing Robert Ingersoll. Ingersoll made the argument over 100 years ago that sometimes the people were ready to advance and the pastors weren't, and sometimes it was the other way. The pastors were ready to advance and the flock wasn't.
This is a very interesting journal. I used to teach religion and American society, and so I had to subscribe to various denominations. And I found it very interesting to find there are all kinds of Christians. In fact, some of our rationalists of East Tennessee would have much in common with some Baptists and some Methodists and some Lutherans, it seems to me.
I assume all denominations are going to have their more liberal branch.
Exactly.
And then there are going to be some that are more fundamentalists that at least I'm going to find myself at considerable odds with.
Yeah, I think they're even fundamentalist atheists.
Well, I try to live up to that for you now and then.
You're too open-minded. Okay, let's get started to our topic.
All right, so we're going to talk about biblical criticism. And so my exposure to something like this is really based on, or was Old Testament, and that was when I read the Freeman book on who wrote the Bible, but he really meant the Old Testament. And he didn't touch much, well, he didn't touch any on the New Testament that I recall. So in that book, I learned about these multiple sources. There was a J source, and I'm going to say E source. There was a redactor. There was a P source, priestly source, and it feels like I'm missing one more source.
D for the Deuteronomy.
D for Deuteronomy. And that was all very interesting. He made a compelling case, and I must admit I wasn't here in the studio the day that you had Aaron Darby on, and we're discussing that. But it made me feel that I think that book I read was written in the late 1980s, and it's made me feel that perhaps the scholarship has moved on a little bit.
Oh, yes.
And but nevertheless, I'm still blind to the New Testament.
Well, what we're trying to emphasize is that history the writing of history doesn't just drop in out of the blue. It has all kinds of sources.
Yes.
Some are very reliable, and also we want to emphasize in antiquity what we call rigorous historical inquiry is somewhat different in those days. You had a lot of imagination, and
they were writing for perhaps a different purpose and a different audience.
That's a good way to put it.
And when it happened to be accurate history, it might have been. It wasn't by the same design we have now, where we say, let's include nothing that is not verifiable.
Well, they had a difficult time. I mean, I wrote an article on this once, and I think it was published in Sweden, in the Old Testament. I argued that these people knew what lying was.
Okay.
And they knew when you told one story and then you had misrepresentation, they knew what that was. So my question is, should we not hold accountable the writers to their own standards, is what I'm saying. And I'll get a simple example. If someone says that a snake talked to Adam and Eve, I want to know how they knew that. See, I mean, this is just normal, everyday historical inquiry. And when a Christian asks a Mormon, how do you know Joseph Smith had those golden plates? He's pressing
the same kind of point. Yeah, okay. So, yeah, it's funny you bring up the snake story, because it's the conversation I want to have with believers most, is to say, why should I take this book seriously when it has a talking snake? And I've asked myself the question, why is there a talking snake in there? And I can't help but think that it merely began as a children's story. Is there any better explanation?
Well, it's hard to get inside somebody's head.
All right.
Well, but after all, that story was written much later in Hebrew history. In other words, it's supposed to be about early human life.
If I remember the claim made by Friedman, that
it's post-exilic, post-exile.
Yes, that in a sense, the early part of Genesis was written to kind of create a backstory to the rest of Genesis and the other books of the Pentateuch.
Yeah, in fact, it starts off with Elohim as the God, right in the verse 1 and 2, and then you get into, after the second chapter, you get into Yahweh. It's a different name, and then you got Adonai coming on. And my contention is, and I think a lot of biblical scholars think this, that you had various sources and various cultures with different names of their gods, and these redactors later on tried to put them together into one coherent story if they could.
Well, having read the Bible on my own, it took me 2 years. I was constantly left thinking, how do people read this thing and not see it as, well, I can only say it's not merely a book with falsehoods. It's a poorly written book. But upon reading the book about how the Bible was written and realizing what their challenges were, that they had these disparate sources, I then realized the problem in front of the editor, and I'm of the opinion that the editor, as bad as the book is, the editor was a genius for pulling something out of all of those different sources.
A genius. And remember now, you might have read the King James translation.
I got my Bible from a motel room. It would be the Gideon version.
That's 1611 English. So
the Gideon is not. It's been somewhat modernized.
They've got a modernized version of it.
I've compared it against some things that are in King James. All right, viewers, call in and inform Faithless Forest. If you know with authority what the Gideon Bible's based on, I would like to know.
So let's get on to the New Testament now.
So now we have new letters to learn about, and I guess I've heard of this Q document. Help me there with the New Testament.
Yeah, someone wrote a novel called the Q document, but basically it's what scholars, just the German, first letter in the German word for source.
All right.
And when you read Matthew and Luke,
okay,
it seems as if they had Mark as a common source.
Okay.
And they also seem to have another source, and they don't know what to call it, so they just call it the Q document. And
they infer that there's this Q document because there's some things in them that are not in Mark, which you said they had some elements in common.
Matthew and Luke.
Okay.
And so what we're saying is that these are various sources. It's like a river, and you got to find the streams that flow into it.
Is there any idea on the dates of these documents?
Well, now that's a big problem. We think that the Gospel of Mark, which really doesn't have any resurrection stories to amount to anything, is about 70 A.D. And then Matthew maybe is around 85, and Luke about the same, or a little later, probably a little later.
All right.
Because some think he wrote also, whoever wrote, Luke wrote the book of Acts. And then John is probably about 100. I mean, it's right at the end of the century.
All right.
And Acts is probably 125 some A.D. I mean, that's not a gospel, of course. It's called the book of Acts. And scholars nowadays are beginning to think the Acts was written much later than they thought.
Do they still attribute it to the same author of John?
No.
Really?
Some think the same author of the Acts and Luke are the same.
Oh, I misspoke. Luke and Acts. Or did I mishear?
Yeah,
Luke,
you're right.
Luke
and Acts.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And this is a mixture of source criticism and textual criticism.
Okay, can you define for me and the audience source criticism and textual criticism?
Yeah,
so
textual criticism, is trying to find out about the manuscripts and the documents, whether they're on papyrus or vellum or whatever, trying to find out what's already put down and been written and when. For example, the ending of Mark. First of all, nobody has just the Bible all together in an ancient document of say the first century. You just don't have it. You just have manuscripts and fragments, and then scholars later try to put them together.
Okay,
and that's called textual criticism. Now, for example, the ending of Mark 16, starting with verse 9 there, is probably not, well, it's not in the earlier manuscript. Two of the earlier best manuscripts, it's just not there. And so scholars think it was simply added on. And,
okay.
And you've got it. Can you read?
All right. So this is Mark.
This is the King James Version. In some versions, it's not in the...
And you're saying chapter 16, and we're going to start here at verse 15 is where you wanted me to start. So this is after the resurrection. Jesus has come back and met the disciples. And he said unto them, Go ye unto all the world, and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned. And these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name they shall cast out devils. They shall speak with new tongues. And they shall take up serpents. And they shall drink any deadly thing, and it shall not hurt them. And they shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover.
Okay.
All right, well, so much for my dramatic delivery there.
Okay, now that's good enough. And the point is, some of the Pentecostals really like this.
Of course, yes, the talking in tongues. And up in Kentucky, we have some of those snake handlers who've been in the news lately.
But the point is, that passage is not in some of the better manuscripts.
By better, they would be demonstrably older, you mean?
Older, and after the scholars go through and try to evaluate them, they would say whether or not the better manuscripts, and usually the older, the better.
Now, what I read, though, this is King James, so whatever
that would not be in the Revised Standard Version.
In 1611, though, the sources that King James was written from included these.
The Textus Receptus, yes.
Okay.
What's interesting to me is if that's not in the original, who wrote it?
And why?
All
right.
I mean, that's quite a tale. And it's dangerous.
Well,
somebody believes it.
It's busy saying things like, go out into the world and preach the gospel. So that's a commission to be, making converts.
Now, that's you can understand. But to drink poison, it won't hurt you. Handle snakes.
All right.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, why would someone concoct such nonsense?
All right.
In other words, there's pretty good evidence it's not in the better manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark. Most scholars acknowledge that.
Is there a possibility of adding a date to when it was inserted?
No. Well, you have guesses, but the reason it's a guess is you just don't have a first century document of the Bible. They come later. And this passage is later than some of them.
So I've heard of this Council of Nicaea, where in something like 326 or so, there was an attempt by the Roman government, which had gone Christian at that point, to say, all right, we have to standardize the Bible. Would the product of that effort have included these paragraphs? Or is even that effort lost?
No, I think it's in the text. I think you can say it's in the Textus Receptus, which is Erasmus and some of those are using. But I'd have to look that up specifically because it's a very detailed thing.
Maybe I should be asking, is there a word to describe or a phrase to describe the Bible that was, I assume, canonized by the Council of Nicaea?
I think you could do this. See, the problem is you've got so many versions coming along. So can you get to the Council of Nicaea? By then, I think you could say that would be closer to the Textus Receptus. And that would include this passage.
Okay, so you think, so in other words,
Yeah.
The thing that you refer to as
there's also a passage of the woman taken in adultery.
All right.
Story. Now, that's not in some of the better manuscripts. And, of course, Calvin didn't like the story. Anyhow, it's too much forgiveness, I guess, for him. I don't know why. But it makes me wonder. I can see why someone would invent the story. In fact, Charles Spurgeon, it just occurred to me, Charles Spurgeon was a famous London preacher, very famous London preacher. And he gave lectures to ministerial students on sermon preparation, and he cautioned them not to invent sermon illustrations. In other words, don't create things that aren't true.
Okay. And in other words, if you tell too good a tale, it might then compete with the Bible itself. Then. Yeah, that's what he's trying to prevent.
Well, what I'm trying to show is that preachers were doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, now there was no law about kissing the ears of giraffes because nobody's doing it.
All right.
Okay. But what Spurgeon is doing is saying, quit doing this. In other words, don't invent stories.
All right.
He said, he's in effect saying that's dishonest.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm saying that what biblical scholars today are trying to do is try to sort through parts of the Bible to say which actually happened, which part, and which didn't. And that means you've got to have publicly verifiable, testable.
And so thus we are talking about the historicity. Of Jesus, or historicity of the Bible.
Yeah, and you have a group of scholars whom I greatly respect. Some of them are Christians, some are atheists. I mean, it's a combination.
And who is this group?
It's called the Jesus Seminar.
The Jesus Seminar.
Mm-hmm. And they're very good scholars. And what they're trying to figure out is taking the materials that we have. What was this historical Jesus like?
Mm-hmm.
And that's not an easy question to answer. And you got about 4 or 5 different theories.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, you have 4 or 5 different pictures of Jesus.
When you say 4 or 5 different pictures,
one is his apocalyptic visionary.
Okay.
And that is, now that's Bart Ehrman and Schweitzer and others. This is the view they hold.
So, I've read one Bart Ehrman book. It was on the Gospel of
Judas.
Of Judas, yeah. And that's where I learned some aspects of early Christianity that just dazzled me. Meaning, I had no idea there was such diversity. But he spoke about the apocalyptic view as being, and actually maybe it's not clear, or I'm not remembering clearly. Does he mean something like an end of the world like we think of as Revelations, or does he mean something merely like the end of Roman rule and the overthrow of Roman rule and establishment of a new Israeli kingdom?
Well,
does apocalypse work for both of those?
Put those two together.
All right.
In other words, what they're saying, the end of the present order. Now, and you got to sympathize with those people in those days. Here they were dominated by the Greeks for decades. And then the Romans come in with their soldiers and their ideology, and they're trying to impose a lot of it. And so they naturally resent it. And since they can't do much about it, they have these grandiose schemes that someday the deity will break into history and deliver them, is a good way to put it. That's what the word salvation really means in that context. Deliverance from these enemies.
All right.
Now, in my opinion, those who, well, put it this way, those who think Jesus was an apocalyptic visionary says he was a good preacher, a good speaker going around town, around the countryside, telling people to, be kind and be decent. Blessed are the poor, blessed are the peacemakers, and permit the little children to come unto me. I mean, this is a good, decent man. The golden rule.
All right.
And then some think this same man believed that there would be a new kingdom coming in supernaturally to transform, to make it, to do away with poverty, to do away with suffering, to make this a kind of heaven on earth. And that all the tyranny that they've been suffering under would be abolished.
So from Ehrman's book, though, I kind of got the impression that the apocalyptic movement was merely looking for someone to be a new King David who would be a military leader, and they, with their own swords, would deliver themselves. Perhaps God would make those swords extra effective, like he did in the Old Testament where, a small army would go out and defeat something 10 times as large. But it wasn't like it was just they're going to wake up and things are magically transformed.
Well, okay, and Bart Ehrman is right, and that's one version of the apocalyptic. And in other words, you had the Maccabean revolt about 163 BC.
Okay.
And that didn't work. And you had in 69 to 70 AD, you had another revolt, and that didn't work. And what some say is Jesus had the notion that you really couldn't defeat the Romans. The Jews didn't have that much power. And the early Christians,
there wasn't a military solution.
You couldn't. In other words, it'd be naive. And Jesus on the cross, saying, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" He's there, still apparently suddenly disillusioned that this is not happening. This sudden supernatural inbreak. And so you have Paul coming in from outside Israel with, in my opinion...
Okay, so Paul now is the author of other books.
In fact, he's the author of the earliest parts of the New Testament. The Gospels come later.
So what's the date on Paul?
Well, Paul's writings are somewhere around 50, and he died in the 60s.
He died in his age 60s or in
the 60s,
60 AD?
Yeah, 60-something. I'll have to look it up again. And you have James down in Jerusalem, who apparently is functioning like a bishop down there.
He's running.
And he dies around 66, somewhere around at the same time.
Okay.
And now, my point is that you had various versions of this movement. James, for example, who's a brother of Jesus, apparently has one version, and Peter goes along with him. They're in Jerusalem, and they're in Israel. And then Paul, coming from outside, brings in a lot of the mystery religions and tries to blend this Jewish apocalypticism in with his mystery religion. And he calls it, he has various names. He says that he's resolved to preach nothing but Christ crucified.
Okay.
Now, that's a dead giveaway, and you look for the teachings of Jesus in the Apostle Paul, and you keep looking, because many scholars say that those teachings are simply not there. You don't find the parables. You don't find the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount.
Okay.
And so Paul brings in his viewpoint, blends it with some of those Jerusalem believers, but he's at odds with them, and says he rebuked Peter to his face. Now, that's what's so interesting.
And this is over bringing non-Jews into the belief, into the church?
Well, apparently the big feud was some of the Gentiles who were coming in, some of the believers under James and Peter were saying they need to be circumcised.
So there's the circumcision question
and the dietary.
Yeah. All right.
And Paul is opposing this because that's nationalizing the religion. And Paul, having come from outside, he is, in that sense, got a new Israel. And what he's saying is that there is this covenant with Abraham, the founder, and Abraham is before Moses. So that's why Paul wants to go back to the faith of Abraham and outflanks Moses. Moses brought the Torah.
Okay, and therefore outflanked the laws of Moses, the
Torah,
Leviticus, and so on.
Exactly.
All right, obsolete them, so to speak.
Obsolete.
And obsolete the priest system that goes with them.
Exactly.
All right.
And
you can tell I've been listening to your other shows. I'm getting that thread from you.
Okay, now you can get the picture then. Here's Paul. Now, see, Paul has all these visions. Now, what I'm contending, that these visions are just a reflection of his thinking. Are you with me?
All right.
The thinking is, this sacrificial system with all these priests, that's not going to work for the whole Gentile world that he's trying to be a missionary to.
There you go. Yeah, they're not all going to make a pilgrimage to the temple for all that. No. Joe, I think we've been told we got a call here.
Good. Let's hear what we have.
Hello, caller. Please give us a name or a nickname.
Jeffrick.
Hello, Jeffrick. Well, our regular from Illinois.
I'm from Toronto, Canada.
Toronto, good.
All right.
I'm a regular, but I'm from Toronto area.
I'll get that wrong every time.
Go ahead.
Give us a question or comment, please.
Hi, how are you? You mentioned, Joe mentioned earlier that, yeah, I'm getting an echo here on my phone. Anyway, Joe mentioned earlier that Paul brought into the Christian religion or aspects other parts from other parts, from other sects or cults. You have to keep in mind, you're probably accurate, because if you remember, Paul, before he had his conversion, was a persecutor of these Jewish sects, the Messiah sects. He knew a lot about other groups and their beliefs. And he edited, probably in his own mind, he was a bit crazy. And we end up with Christianity because of Paul, and pretty much not anyone else.
All right.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Cole. You have to forgive my voice.
Oh, okay.
And now, was there a question there? I thought you were leading into a question.
Do you agree? Because I was thinking Paul was more worldly than the other. And I don't think Jesus was a real person. I think he's just a conglomeration of many myths and stories, all of which Paul would have known, and maybe a few real teachers like Simon of Petra and Apollonia of Tyrene. They might have been real people.
Yeah,
no actual Jesus of Christ.
Well, you got two different questions there. Whether it's Christ, that's another man, another concept. Whether there was someone named Jesus or Joshua, there very likely were many Joshuas around there. Many mothers would want to name their sons Joshua, who was a great hero in Hebrew history. And very likely there was a Joshua who had some good sayings and had some followers. I think there's enough evidence to say that. G.A. Wells, I think I've mentioned on this program, G.A. Wells from England has written about 4 books arguing that there was no historical Jesus. And it's a very good scholarly piece of work. His last book, however, he changed his mind. I always admired scholars who can say, well, I've got another theory I think makes more sense. And he thinks there was a historical Jesus, not a supernatural savior. Just think there was a guy there named Jesus, and he had some followers, and he had some views.
And I assume that in his last book, then he would have said, well, then these particular passages of the Bible reflect a continuity of this one person.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that other things are either invented fiction or they come from others.
Yeah, that's what's called redaction criticism nowadays.
All right. And redaction means to...
You modify and change and add on to the story. And here's a good example of this passage in Mark. Just added on words put into the mouth of Jesus that most scholars think simply never happened in the first place. It's not even in good manuscripts. But so we do have to say that somebody invented it. So maybe there were other things that were invented.
All right. Well, Jeffrick, did you have any more comments or questions?
Oh, yeah, one more. I mean, does anyone believe that Moses was a real person?
That's another big problem.
It goes back to the original question here, because the guy who replaced Moses after Moses' death was Joshua. You mentioned the heroic Joshua.
Uh-huh.
But Joshua as a name is more of a title. It just means God's anointed. They didn't know what the guy's real name was who led the Hebrew invasion of Canaan. So it must have been God's anointed.
Okay.
Joshua, the hero from the Old Testament, is likely to be as fictional as Joshua ben Joseph.
Okay, up there closer to where you are in Michigan is a woman named...
Canada.
Well, that's where she is. You're in Canada, but she's in Michigan. That's what I'm trying to say. And this woman in Michigan, Margaret Morris, has written, I can't remember the title offhand, but she has tried to show that the story of Moses is probably built on the story of the son of Ramses II. In other words, it's a mythical story, but it has some historical roots, like a lot of myths. But whether Moses climbed up, we now think that the Torah was not there given to Moses on the Mount Sinai, that's mostly pure fiction. Now, so what's left of Moses, that's a matter of nitty-gritty details.
Well, certainly, an argument's been made that archaeologists have looked over the Sinai Desert pretty thoroughly, and you just don't find evidence of there having been people having done a migration through there.
The Exodus from Egypt, that's not very well supported anymore.
Untenable, perhaps, would be the way to say it.
Untenable, yeah. It's dramatized. In other words, obviously some people moved, but it's been overly dramatized.
Yeah. Well, there would have been, trade and cultural exchange going on all that time.
Exactly, yeah. And therefore, cultural exchange and cultured exchange. Yeah. Okay, was our call from Canada. You have another question or comment?
No, it's been interesting talking to you gentlemen again.
All righty.
I'll talk again in the future.
I hope you get rid of your cold or whatever, okay?
I do too.
Thank you much.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay. We're a little past the halfway point here. Perhaps we should try and remember our mid-program break. If you've got text for it, we'll read it. Otherwise, I'll wing it.
Let's see. Go ahead and wing it, because I don't think...
You've been watching Freethought Forum TV, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. You'll find us here most Tuesdays from 5 to 6 p.m. Tell your out-of-town friends they can watch us online at ctvknox.org. And are we ready to roll our promotional video? All right, make it so.
If you live in or around the Knoxville area and are questioning your religious beliefs or simply believe in one less God than everyone else, well, you're not alone. The Atheist Society of Knoxville is a fun and friendly group of people just like you that meets twice a week at a bar or restaurant. We meet every Tuesday night following the show at Barley's Tap Room and Pizzeria for happy hour. You'll find our group either inside or on the patio. Look for Richard Dawkins' silver-jacketed book, The God Delusion, standing upright on the table. On Fridays, we meet at Agave Azul or the Beard and Beer Market. But if you plan to preach, proselytize, provoke, or punch, please don't. We all question what we believe at one point in our lives. If this is the time for you, come join us for food, drink, conversation, and fun. Do you find stories of talking snakes laughable? Do you prefer the scientific method over supernatural beliefs? Are you concerned about religious leaders and organizations imposing their values and rules on your body, your family, and the rest of our society? Well, take comfort in the fact that you're not alone. The Rationalists of East Tennessee meets weekly for fellowship and provides a forum for people who support skeptical thinking and rational discussion of these and other issues. To find out more information or to find out about our next meeting, visit us on the web at www.rationalist.org.
Well, welcome back. I'd like to invite viewers to call in now. The phone line is open, and we got 20 minutes or so we can entertain comments or questions. I want to mention that the Rationalists of East Tennessee has Sunday activities of lively presentations, topical and timeless, and this Sunday is Book Club, the Skeptics Book Club. It happens at Books A Million at 8513 Kingston Pike. It's at 2 o'clock p.m. in the afternoon, and I'm working from memory here. The book is something like Race, A Troublesome Inheritance. You can find the exact title of the book on our website, rationalists.org. Look for the calendar on the left, look for the colored dates, click them, and it'll open up a little dialogue that explains in more detail. All right. Shall we go back to our topic here?
Yeah, let me suggest there's several versions of who Jesus was, one of which is, of course, this apocalyptic visionary that we talked about. Another one is that Jesus was a cynic. Now, I want to emphasize the word cynic is not the way we use it today. Mm-hmm. It's more in a historical context. The cynics in those days were people who were trying to simplify life and were somewhat disillusioned about some of the superficial icing on society that was costly. Mm-hmm. And so Jesus wanted to try to simplify, to make life, the golden rule, kindness, goodness, all of that.
All right.
Rather than all of the complexity that religions have built up with all the rituals. And
might this be a reaction of something like, let's say, a more rural population versus an urban population?
I think you've got the point. And the blessed, the poor, and particularly in Galilee, were, in my opinion, being almost robbed. Do we have another caller? Oh, good.
All right.
Go ahead, caller.
Give us a name or a nickname, please, so that we know how to address you.
BJ?
Hello, BJ. I believe you've called before.
I have, and I just want to once again call to you how sorry I feel for you poor folks. This is the only way you think you can get attention.
Uh-huh. Well, actually, we find other ways to get attention.
Yeah, you go to public and restaurants and set your book with those offensive titles up on tables to also garner attention.
Well, actually, that's so that people can find us. Did you have a comment or did you have any kind of question today? We're talking about the historicity of the Jesus and biblical criticism.
Right. Can you pinpoint the day or the time when your mom or dad did something to you to make you feel as though you have to do this to get attention?
Well, one way to get attention is to listen to people on a television program and then call in.
That's very good.
Okay. Well, thank you for calling.
All righty. Well,
let's go.
Let's see.
Oh, now another view that I want to emphasize on the historical Jesus question.
Yeah.
Paul, in particular, brought in his view of Jesus as, quote, the Son of God.
All right.
Now, this is not a new phrase. David is called the Son of God. None of the kings were called sons of God. You have over in the 6th chapter of Genesis, the sons of God, apparently angels in heaven.
They came down and made love to the daughters of men.
And produced giants in that story.
It doesn't say specifically they produced giants. It just says there were giants in those days. Is that the implication? I don't know.
I think that's the implication.
And that may be the Gideon phrasing. Maybe King James would be more definite on that.
But anyhow, the point I'm trying to make is there are various views that scholars have come up with on who this historical Jesus, one of which is Paul came up with a view that this was a supernatural being on earth. That's in the epistle to the Philippians, the 2nd chapter.
All right.
He was in the form of God. He humbled himself even to the point of death.
All right.
And became a man, born of woman.
So there's a sentence you said. He was in the form of God. Mm-hmm. Now, Christians kill one another over the divinity and, part human, fully human, mm-hmm. both fully human and fully divine. So when you say in the form of God, what do you mean by that?
Well, that unfortunately is a very difficult question because you have Adam and Eve, the first couple created in the image of God.
Okay.
See, What does that mean? That God didn't have 2 feet and a nose and the eardrums. So what does that mean? Well, most scholars have taken that to mean rational thinking and the capacity, what makes us more human, say, than distinguishes, say, from a cow.
Well, let me take the opposing point of view, though. Also in Genesis, we have God walking through the garden in the cool of the afternoon or something like that. The word walking is used. And then, as if he's, the deity is experiencing the garden just as Adam and Eve would. Okay,
you got two, actually, that's Yahweh.
All right.
The Elohim, the one I was just talking about.
But he's more remote. Elohim is more remote.
Yeah, he's the creator. And then here you have Yahweh functioning like, it sounds like
a big man?
Well, it's called anthropomorphism.
All right.
Anthropos means human.
All right.
And then it's in the form of a human.
All right.
And then a lot of the Greek gods were the same way.
Yes.
And so when people are trying to think of their gods, they have, for example, you have a big problem of whether Moses could see the face of God. And then you have the passage, if you see the face of God, you couldn't live. So they had this kind of worrying over the problem.
There are contradictions in there. There's someone else who's said to have seen the face of God, and is that Isaiah?
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Ezekiel's.
There we go.
Okay.
It started with an I.
Well, let's get back on this Jesus topic.
All right.
And now, the Paul's view is he did come as a human, but he was also at the same time omniscient deity.
All right.
And that is, he knew everything, and he could. That is, if you're going to be God in that Hebrew tradition, he's going to be omniscient, all-knowing. But, however, he is not omnipresent because he's in a body. So he's there in Jerusalem, in Galilee, and he's not over in America. So that sense you've lost some of the omnipresence.
So if you're saying this is Paul who's saying that.
Yeah.
If Paul was here right now, I'd say, well, does that mean that God, as Jesus, when God's walking around as Jesus, he's not able to answer prayers from someone, off at some distance?
Okay, now that's something you don't have Paul dealing with directly, in my opinion. But he does say he's a divine being. Now, the question is, if you're becoming human, then you're going to lose something, otherwise you're not human. And that's the big issue that the Christians divided on. We've got another caller.
Hello. Can you give us a name or a nickname, please, so that we know how to address you?
Yes, my name's Dale.
Hello. Did I hear Dale?
Dale.
Oh, good. Go ahead.
All right. Give us a comment or a question, please.
Yeah, I have both. In regard to Moses, in leading the Hebrews out of Egypt to Mount Sinai, I'm kind of wondering who gave the name to that mountain, Mount Sinai? How did that mountain get its name?
You got me. I have to look that up.
I have no idea either. I also believe that, at least in modern times, it's controversial what mountain that would even be.
Yeah, or even where it would be, because I don't think he had a map. And I was wondering if he lived, who gave it to him.
Well, but the implication in the Bible is that Moses, had traveled back and forth. He had been up in Canaan and stuff, and then he went back to Egypt. He fled Egypt after killing a supervisor. That's an overseer. So they traveled around, and maybe someone had, as he was walking by it the last time, someone had said, "Oh, that's Mount Sinai."
Yeah. Decided maybe that'd be a good name for it, I guess.
All right. Did you have another question? We didn't do well with that one. We had to bunt.
Yeah, I was thinking, a lot of times during the days of the Roman Empire, the Hebrew, the Jews had a very difficult time because they didn't want to live according to that system. And so I was wondering if a lot of the scriptures regarding deliverance was maybe that in reference to deliverance from the Roman Empire or that system of the Roman Empire.
You're asking about deliverance from the Roman government?
Yeah.
Okay, well, and I want to thank you for the question because we need to deal with that. That's a big problem that they were having in those days. Big problem. Is the Jews were being persecuted, they believed, and that they had believed themselves to be a chosen people. So the question emerges, why are they not so well off?
Why are they being subjugated by a foreign power?
Yeah, now this question has been over and over in Hebrew history because you had the Syrians overrunning Israelites.
So somewhere around 900 A.D., the Syrians come from the north and capture the northern half of the kingdom.
And about 722, and then you've got 586 deliverance from from another tyrant. Now, the problem is the prophets often came up with a theory, first of all, that God's in control. Mm-hmm. Now, if God's in control, why are the chosen people not doing well? And so the answer that some of the prophets come up with is, well, the chosen people aren't behaving properly, and so God takes Cyrus, these foreign ruler, and brings him in to punish the Israelites. That's, in other words, they're emphasizing that God is in control. It's Yahweh.
In other words, they have no one but themselves to blame.
Yeah.
And there's perhaps another subtle point that, and you better listen to the priests and pay your sacrifice, and then God will make it all right.
And they had another choice of saying either this deity is not in control or he's not in full control. And these prophets didn't want to come up with that conjecture. They didn't want to modify their theory of God.
Right.
Now, but they also said that God put a lying spirit in the mouth of prophets. In other words,
there are prophets who prophesize false prophets.
Yeah, and they have God leading people to do evil. Now, why? Because evil is being done. It's got to be explained.
Yes.
And so if God is in control, then they conclude, well, then God must choose these people to do evil. And that's the theory of the devil, that the devil is really, to put it bluntly, is doing the dirty work that God doesn't do directly. And
it's a subcontractor.
It's a subcontractor for evil. Now, that's the price they pay then for a notion of an omnipotent deity. And then that's where the devil theory comes in. You would ask, now, why would a good and decent deity with that kind of power, why would he put this demon in power, this much power, for ages?
Well, of course, then some people are going to say, oh, well, he's there to tempt people, and people are given free will.
That's what one of the callers said.
Okay.
That he left the impression you couldn't be tempted without the devil, which raises the question, how did the devil get tempted? Because you got to have another devil. Well, if so, then how does that devil get tempted?
Either the devil was tempted into evil, or the devil was instructed to do evil, one way or the other.
In which case, if he was instructed, that throws it back into the lap of the deity. And that's what some of these... and then one of the questions is, why did Jesus have to die? You see, now one theory Paul came up with is that he died for the sins of the people. Mm-hmm. Now, I could understand the statement, he died because of the sins of people, because you had evil people, and they killed him, but that's different from saying he died for their sins, you see. So,
well, that means it's making an offering to the deity when you say for.
That sounds like an offering to the deity.
Yeah.
Now, did the deity, now some preachers seem to think, and Anselm and Abelard are two priests. Anselm gave the view that God's honor was at stake and somebody's got to pay the price.
God's honor is at stake.
Yeah.
Well, there's a concept. If his honor is at stake, honor is a kind of thing where you want to, not appear foolish or ignorant or evil.
It's your reputation
in front of other people, and so it would be God's honor with what in the eyes of humanity.
Well, that's a good question. This is where this comes from. But Anselm's view was that God had to demand that somebody pay the price. Mm-hmm. And so, out of his goodness, he says to Jesus in heaven, go down and get executed, and I'll resurrect you in 3 days anyhow. I mean, that's the sum and substance.
Go down and have a bad weekend.
That's what it amounts to. Yeah.
All right.
And then God just wipes it out. Well, unfortunately, Paul picked this up. Now, fortunately, on the other side, from Paul's point of view, it did eliminate this. In other words, Paul says, I'm going to get to the root of all of this sacrificial system and eliminate it once and for all. Mm-hmm. And now, granted that as a Jew, he knew it was wrong to have human sacrifice. Mm-hmm. That's wrong in the Hebrew tradition. Mm-hmm. But he overlooked this in the crucifixion of Jesus. And then he uses the crucifixion of Jesus to simply abolish the whole sacrificial system once and for all, which in some ways is ingenious.
Well, in previous shows, you mentioned that it's also an attack against maybe the priest system,
the Sadducees in particular,
and so what kind of a government do you think Paul wanted to see rise up? Was he happy to see the Romans still in charge then, and he just wanted to have a church in parallel?
That's a fascinating question, because in Romans 13, he says, in effect, the government is in power was appointed by God. Mm-hmm.
This is the render unto Caesar what is Caesar's.
Well, that's in the Gospels, but it fits.
Okay.
Because some of the Gospels seem to be pretty much under the influence.
Right. It was someone asking Jesus about the coins. All right.
But it's the same motif.
Okay.
So now you have Paul not coming up with any new political system so much. He is for individual salvation, and then the people can get together in groups and survive under the Roman Empire.
We've only got a minute left, but would Paul have had an apocalyptic view? Did he think that there was going to be an end times happening?
Well, he seemed to think that this whole thing is about to end up in his time. Mm-hmm. In fact, he does have an apocalyptic worldview. Yeah, and some of these people, apparently he had to write and say, but don't quit your work yet. And he who does not work shall not eat.
All right.
In other words, he's saying that it's coming in, it's going to end soon. But then he has to say, don't quit your work. Stay with it and let God decide when it's going to come.
All right.
That's what it amounts to.
Well, yeah, in Bart Ehrman's book on the Gospel of Judas, he talked about how the emphasis on redemption from sin took over from apocalyptic writings as it became obvious that none of the apostles were alive anymore.
Exactly.
And that it wasn't getting wrapped up anytime soon.
No.
Okay. Speaking of wrapping up, though, Joe, we've got less than a minute to go. Looks like you got a book cover there to push.
Yeah, it's called The Apocalyptic Movement, and that's a very good book on there. Here's another one. It's called Gospel Fictions. And then here's one, The Faith Healers.
All right. Yeah, that was from that chapter in...
And there's a very interesting book called When Prophecy Failed. It's by an Old Testament scholar. Very good book, When Prophecy Failed.
All right. Well, you've been watching Freethought TV. This is a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. You can visit our Facebook page, Freethought Forum TV, and leave us comments. We will be back here next week at this time, most every Tuesday.